There was once a maid who lived and worked in a house that was far grander than anything she had ever imagined. The mansion sat at the top of a hill, surrounded by tall trees and a fence that looked like it had been standing there for 100 years. From the outside it was beautiful. Shining windows, trimmed gardens, and marble steps that glistened in the morning sun. But inside it was a place where voices echoed and footsteps never seemed to stop. Every morning before the sun rose, the maid woke up to the sound of the kitchen clock ticking. She would tie her hair back, wash her face with cold water, and step into her worn shoes. Her day always started the same, sweeping the long hallways, dusting the furniture that no one touched, and polishing things that already looked clean. She worked quietly, never asking questions, never speaking unless spoken to. To the rich people who owned the house, she was just part of the background, someone who made the house shine but was invisible within it. Her small room was tucked away behind the kitchen, where the servants lived. The walls were thin, and at night she could hear the cook humming or the butler snoring. Her room had one small window that looked out to the garden. When she wasn't working, she would sit there for a while, staring at the trees and thinking about her village, the place she had left behind years ago. She didn't have much, but she carried a small wooden box with her wherever she went. Inside that box was an old photograph of her father and a folded sheet of paper with a few lines of music written on it. Her father had been a street musician in her village. He played a simple old piano in the market square, and though his hands were rough and his clothes were torn, his music always drew a small crowd. She had grown up listening to him play, every note full of heart and honesty. He taught her that music wasn't about talent or skill. It was about feeling something deeply and letting others feel it too. When her father passed away, she stopped playing. The piano was sold to pay for food, and she left her village to work in the city. That was how she found this job, cleaning and cooking in a house where no one knew her story. The family she worked for was one of the wealthiest in the town. They threw grand parties that lasted until dawn. Guests arrived in shiny cars and glittering dresses. The air filled with laughter, music, and the sound of glasses clinking. But for the servants, those nights meant long hours and aching feet. They would move quietly through the rooms, serving food, clearing dishes, and making sure everything looked perfect. The maid never joined in the laughter. She would watch from a distance, admiring the piano in the corner of the ballroom. It was a grand instrument, black and polished, sitting quietly beneath the chandelier. No one ever touched it. The family had bought it years ago, but no one in the house played. Still, every time she passed by, she would pause for a second. Her eyes would follow its keys, white and perfect like a row of untouched dreams. Sometimes, late at night when everyone was asleep, she would walk past the ballroom and just stand there for a moment. The moonlight from the window would fall across the piano, and it would almost seem alive. She could feel her fingers wanting to touch the keys to press just one note. Not to make music, but just to feel it again. But she never did. She was a maid. Her job was to clean, not to dream. Her days passed in silence. The rich never looked at her, not out of cruelty, but because they didn't notice her. She could be standing right beside them and they would talk as if she wasn't there. It didn't make her angry anymore. She had grown used to being invisible. Yet sometimes when she carried trays of food or polished silver, she wondered if her father would be proud of her now. He used to say, "You have music in your hands, child. Don't ever let it fade." But here she was, letting it fade away note by note, day by day. One morning, while cleaning the ballroom, she stopped beside the piano again. The sunlight fell across it, and for a moment she could see her reflection in the glossy surface. Her hands were dry and cracked, her uniform faded. She looked older than her years. On a quiet impulse, she lifted the lid and ran a finger across the keys, and not pressing, just touching. Dust clung to her fingertips. The sound of footsteps made her jump back. The butler entered, glancing at her with mild suspicion. She lowered her eyes immediately, pretending to polish the nearby chair. He didn't say anything, but his look said enough. She was not supposed to touch what didn't belong to her. After he left, she felt her heart beating fast. It was a strange feeling. Not fear exactly, but something else. Something that made her want to cry for no reason. That night, she couldn't sleep. The image of the piano kept floating in her mind. She remembered how her father used to play late into the night, when everyone else was asleep. She would lie in bed listening to his music, soft and warm, wrapping around her like a blanket. She missed that feeling and the peace it gave her. At midnight, she quietly got out of bed. The others were asleep, the house silent except for the ticking of the big clock in the hallway. She walked barefoot to the ballroom. Her hands trembled a little as she pushed the door open. The moonlight poured through the window, spilling across the piano. The room looked like it was holding its breath. She approached the piano slowly. Her fingers hovered above the keys. She thought of her father, his tired eyes, his smile when he played. Then very softly she pressed one key, just one. The sound was pure and clear, echoing through the empty room. It was such a small thing, yet it felt like the whole house had turned to listen. That single note seemed to stay in the air longer than it should have. It was fragile, but it carried something deep, a memory, a longing, a piece of her heart. She stood there for a long time, her finger still resting on the key. When the sound finally faded, she closed the lid gently and walked back to her room. Her chest felt lighter, her eyes wet. For the first time in years, she felt alive again. In the following days, she couldn't stop thinking about that moment. Every time she entered the ballroom, she looked at the piano and smiled to herself. She didn't dare touch it again, but just knowing that one note had lived there, her note, was enough. It was like a secret she carried in her heart. Life went on as usual. The family continued their parties, the servants continued their work. The maid stayed quiet and careful, yet something had changed inside her. She started humming softly while she worked, little tunes she remembered from her childhood. The cook noticed once and said, "You have a sweet voice," to which she only smiled shyly. She didn't tell anyone about that night. Some things were too precious to explain, but sometimes fate has a way of revealing what people try to hide. One afternoon, when she thought the family had gone out, she entered the ballroom to clean. The piano stood there, dust settling gently on its surface. Without thinking, she lifted the lid again. Her fingers brushed the keys. She pressed one note, just one like before. What she didn't know was that someone had come back early that day. The lady of the house stood by the doorway, frozen, listening to that single sound. She didn't speak, and the maid didn't notice her. The sound filled the room, soft but full of emotion. When the maid turned around and saw her standing there, her face went pale. She opened her mouth to apologize, but the lady raised her hand, signaling her to stop. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them felt heavy but not unkind. The lady's eyes softened, and after a few seconds, she said quietly, "You can play. Don't stop yourself." The maid didn't understand what to say. No one had ever spoken to her like that before. Her heart beat fast, but she nodded slowly. That night, she lay in her bed thinking about what the lady had said. The words kept echoing in her head. Don't stop yourself. It was the beginning of something she didn't yet understand, something that would change everything in that house. Not just for her, but for everyone who heard her music. That night, the maid didn't sleep. The words she heard from the lady of the house kept replaying in her mind. You can play. Don't stop yourself. It didn't sound like an order. It didn't even sound like permission. It was something softer, something that felt almost like kindness. For someone like her, kindness was rare. Most of the time, she was spoken to only when there was work to be done. So hearing those words made her heart feel strange, heavy but warm at the same time. The next morning, when she went to the ballroom to clean, she moved carefully around the piano. She dusted its edges and wiped the keys without pressing a single one. But this time, she didn't feel like she was stealing something by touching it. She felt like she had been quietly invited to. The lady of the house didn't mention the piano incident again. She acted as if nothing had happened, speaking to the maid in her usual calm tone. But sometimes, when she walked past the ballroom and saw the maid there, she would pause for a moment, almost like she was listening. The days went on, busy and full of noise. The servants hurried through their tasks. Guests came and went, leaving the house full of perfume and laughter that didn't belong to the people who worked there. Yet even in all that rush, the maid carried a quiet excitement inside her. She had been seen, not as a servant, but as someone who held a story worth noticing. One rainy afternoon, when the family was away visiting relatives, the maid found herself alone in the ballroom. The rain tapped gently on the tall windows. The whole house felt softer, like it was asleep. She sat on the piano bench, her hands resting on her lap. Her heart beat faster than usual. She didn't plan to play, but somehow her fingers found their way to the keys. She started slowly, pressing one note at a time, just to hear how it sounded in the quiet room. Each sound floated in the air before fading into silence. Then, little by little, her hands remembered, not perfectly, but enough. The melody that came out was one her father used to play when the sun set over their small village. It was simple, made of just a few notes, but it carried warmth, the kind that made people stop what they were doing and listen. She closed her eyes as she played, and for a moment she wasn't in that grand house anymore. She was back in the market square, watching her father smile as he played for strangers. She could smell the dust, feel the wind, hear the laughter of children running by. The memory was so real that tears gathered in her eyes. When she finished, she let her hands rest on the keys. She hadn't noticed that someone had been standing at the doorway. The lady of the house was there again, holding a book she had forgotten to take to her study. The maid jumped up, startled and embarrassed. But the lady only smiled softly. "That was beautiful," she said. "Where did you learn to play like that?" The maid didn't know what to say. Her voice came out quiet, almost trembling. "My father taught me before he passed away." The lady nodded slowly, walking closer. "You play with feeling," she said. "That's rare. Many people can play notes, but not many can play emotions." The maid lowered her eyes, unsure what to do with such words. Compliments weren't something she was used to. She mumbled a thank you and stepped back, ready to leave. But the lady said something unexpected. "Would you play again?" The maid looked up, surprised. "Now?" The lady smiled gently. "Yes, I would like to hear you." Her hand shook as she sat back down. She took a deep breath and began to play another song. One she had made up herself years ago when she was just a child watching her father. It wasn't perfect. Her fingers slipped once or twice, but the lady didn't seem to mind. She stood quietly, her eyes far away, like she was remembering something too. When the music ended, the room felt heavier, but not in a sad way, more like it was filled with something too full to hold. The lady took a slow breath and said softly, "You have a gift." "You shouldn't hide it," the maid didn't answer. She just smiled faintly and looked down at her hands. After that day, something changed in the house. The maid didn't play often, but every now and then, when the family wasn't entertaining guests, the lady would ask her to play for a few minutes. The other servants didn't understand it. They whispered among themselves, wondering why the lady would spend time listening to a maid's music. Some said it was strange, others said it was beautiful, but the maid didn't let their words bother her. For her, playing wasn't about being noticed. It was about remembering her father, her village, the days when life was simple and kind. The piano became her secret friend, the only place where she could be herself. Weeks passed. One evening, the house was buzzing with activity again. A grand dinner party was being prepared. Flowers filled every hallway. Lights glowed from every chandelier, and the smell of rich food drifted from the kitchen. The maid worked faster than ever, carrying trays, setting tables, and polishing silver until it shone like mirrors. When the guests arrived, the house turned into a sea of laughter and voices. Music played from a gramophone in the corner, and couples danced across the ballroom floor. The maid stayed near the kitchen door, ready to serve at any moment. But every time she passed the piano, her eyes lingered on it for a second. Near midnight, when most of the guests were still talking and laughing, the gramophone stopped suddenly. The record had finished, and no one noticed. The lady of the house looked around for a moment, then her eyes fell on the maid. She raised a hand slightly, motioning her to come closer. The maid hesitated, unsure if she had understood correctly, but when the lady nodded, she walked toward her nervously. "Would you play something for us?" the lady asked in a low voice. The maid's face went pale. "Me?" she whispered, looking around at the crowd of elegantly dressed people. "Yes, you," the lady said kindly. "You have music in your hands. Let them hear it." The maid's heart raced. Every eye in the room turned to her. She had never been the center of attention before. She could feel her hands trembling as she walked toward the piano. Her uniform felt too plain, her shoes too worn. She sat down slowly, trying not to shake. The room grew quiet. The sound of laughter faded. Even the waiter stopped moving. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath. For a moment, all she could hear was the beating of her own heart. Then she pressed the first key. The sound was soft but strong, floating through the silence like a whisper, then another note and another. The melody she chose was one her father had once called the Song of Open Hearts. It was gentle, full of hope and sadness woven together. At first, the guests looked at one another, unsure what to think. But as she played, something changed in the room. The music grew, filling every corner, wrapping around the people like a quiet story told without words. The lady of the house stood near the wall, her eyes glistening. The men and women who had been laughing a moment ago now sat still, their expressions softening. When the final note faded, there was no sound at all. No one clapped. No one spoke. They just sat there, caught in a moment that didn't seem to belong to the world of wealth and parties. The maid lifted her hands from the keys and looked up. Every face was turned toward her, not with judgment but with something like awe. For a second she didn't know what to do. Then she stood up quietly and bowed her head, ready to return to her place among the servants. It was then that one of the guests finally began to clap, slow and gentle at first, then joined by others. The sound grew louder, echoing through the grand hall. The maid's face turned red and she lowered her head, embarrassed but happy in a way she couldn't explain. The lady walked over to her and whispered, "You made them listen." That night, long after the guests had gone and the lights were dimmed, the maid sat on her bed holding her father's photo. She smiled through tears, whispering, "I played, Papa." They listened. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees, and the house that had always been full of other people's voices now seemed to carry hers too. Soft, humble, but unforgettable. After that night, the house did not feel the same anymore. Something had changed in the air, quiet but deep. The maid still worked her usual hours, still scrubbed the floors and polished the silver. Yet everywhere she went, people looked at her differently. The other servants whispered in the kitchen about how she had played for the rich guests. Some spoke with admiration, others with jealousy. "She's still a maid," one said sharply. "Just because she touched the piano doesn't make her one of them." But another servant replied softly, "Maybe not, but did you see the way they listened? They stopped breathing for her music." The maid heard their whispers sometimes, but she didn't let them trouble her. She had never wanted fame or attention. What she had that night was more than enough, a moment where her music filled the grand hall and reached hearts that usually didn't notice her. The lady of the house, however, could not forget that night either. For days she replayed that music in her head. She had grown up surrounded by fine things, art, jewelry, education, yet none of it had ever made her feel the way those few minutes of music did. It was as if something had reached deep into her and opened a door she didn't know was closed. A few mornings later, the lady called for the maid. The maid arrived quickly, nervous as always. She bowed her head respectfully and waited for instructions. The lady smiled gently and said, "I've been thinking about that evening. The guests were all speaking of your music." The maid's eyes widened slightly. "I am sorry if I caused trouble," she said quickly. The lady shook her head. "No trouble at all. In fact, they were moved. One of them even asked if you had ever played publicly. I told them you hadn't, but—" She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Would you like to learn more?" "To play properly, with lessons." The maid stared at her in disbelief. "Lessons?" she repeated softly. "Yes," the lady said with a kind smile. "You have natural talent. I could ask my old piano teacher to come by once a week. You could learn during the afternoons when your work is lighter. Only if you wish." The maid didn't know what to say. Her throat felt tight, and her eyes filled with tears she tried to hide. "Madam," she said, her voice trembling, "you have already given me more kindness than I ever expected. I don't deserve more." The lady looked at her gently. "Everyone deserves a chance to become what they were meant to be, even if life has hidden it for a while." The maid bowed her head, whispering a quiet thank you. The lessons began the following week. The teacher was an elderly man with kind eyes and thin, patient hands. At first he was puzzled. Teaching a maid was not something he had ever done before, but once he heard her play, his doubt vanished. He saw something rare in her. She played not for attention, not for perfection, but for the feeling of each note. He taught her posture, scales, and technique, but he also told her something that stayed with her forever. Don't lose what you already have inside you. Anyone can learn the notes, but few can play a feeling. As weeks passed, the maid improved quickly. Her fingers moved more confidently, her music clearer, fuller. Sometimes the lady would sit quietly nearby, pretending to read while listening. The maid could feel her presence, and it gave her courage. The rest of the servants began to accept her new routine. Some even grew proud of her. The cook often said, "She's one of us and she's making this house proud." The butler, though stricter, began to treat her with a touch more respect. Yet not everyone in the house saw her rise kindly. The lady's niece, who often visited from the city, found it hard to accept. She was young, wealthy, and proud, and she had always been the one to play the piano during family gatherings. When she heard that the maid had played and impressed the guests, she felt something close to insult. One evening, when she visited again, she said sharply, "A maid should stay in her place. It's charming that she can play a few notes, but let's not make her something she's not." The lady of the house said nothing, only smiled and changed the subject. But her niece's words stayed in the air like a sour taste. The maid didn't know about that conversation. She only knew that her music was growing stronger, her heart lighter. In the evenings, after finishing her duties, she would stay by the piano, playing softly to herself. Sometimes the rain would fall outside and she would play to its rhythm. Other times, when the house was silent, she would play her father's songs, slow, gentle tunes that filled the emptiness with warmth. One night as she played, the lady came to her quietly. "You've made this house feel alive again," she said softly. "I used to think beauty came from things, paintings, gold, music boxes, but now I see it comes from people." The maid looked up, smiling shyly. "It's your kindness that brought it out, madam." The lady shook her head. "No, it was already there, waiting for the right moment." As months passed, the maid became something of a quiet legend among the guests. People who visited often asked if she might play a piece before they left. At first she felt shy about it, but every time she played, the same silence would fill the room, a silence that said more than applause ever could. One winter evening, a special gathering was held at the mansion. Important people from the city attended, politicians, business owners, even musicians. The piano teacher was invited too. The lady of the house wanted to surprise her guests with a performance by the maid. Before the dinner began, the maid stood nervously in her small room, staring at her reflection in the tiny mirror. Her hands trembled. She had played before, but this felt different. These guests were people who judged, who measured everything by status and money. She worried they might laugh, that they might see her as just a servant pretending to belong. The lady came in just before the event. She smiled softly and handed her a small ribbon, pale cream with a single pearl at its center. "For courage," she said. The maid took it carefully, her heart full. When her turn came, she walked into the ballroom slowly. The guests looked curious, some even surprised. A maid playing for them was not something they had expected. The lady introduced her with grace, saying simply, "This is someone whose music comes from the heart." The maid sat at the piano. For a few seconds she couldn't move. Her breath caught in her chest. Then she closed her eyes and let her fingers fall on the keys. She began with a slow tune, one she had written herself after many lonely nights. It started quietly, almost like a whisper, then grew richer, deeper. The melody spoke of longing, of love lost and found again, of small hopes that refused to die. The guests grew still. Even those who had come out of politeness now leaned forward, their eyes fixed on her. The lady's niece, who had once mocked her, stood silently in the corner, her face unreadable. When the music reached its final note, the room remained silent for a moment, just as before. Then, as if breaking from a spell, the guests began to clap, not politely but with real feeling. Some even stood up. The maid's hands shook as she lifted them from the piano. Tears filled her eyes, and for the first time she didn't try to hide them. The piano teacher wiped his eyes quietly. "You have played your soul," he said softly. That night, when everyone had gone and the house fell quiet again, the maid sat alone by the piano. She touched the keys gently and smiled. She didn't know where life would take her next, whether she would stay in this house or return to her village someday. But she knew something for certain. Her father's gift had not died with him. It had only waited, sleeping, until the moment she was brave enough to touch a single note again. Outside, the moonlight filled the ballroom. It shone on the polished piano, on her hands, on the ribbon tied neatly in her hair. Somewhere deep inside, she felt her father's words whisper again. "You have music in your hands, child. Don't ever let it fade." And this time she knew she never would. The days that followed her second performance were quiet but full of a new kind of energy. The mansion no longer felt like the same cold, distant place it once was. There was something softer about it now, something that lingered in the air like the echo of a gentle melody. The servants still worked hard, but they smiled more often. Even the guests who came to visit seemed to walk through the doors with lighter steps, as if they could feel that something special lived inside those walls. The maid's life didn't change on the outside. She still woke before dawn, still scrubbed floors, and still washed the grand staircase that seemed endless. But inside, everything had changed. For the first time in her life, she felt seen. She wasn't just a maid anymore. She was someone whose music had touched hearts. Still, she never allowed herself to forget where she came from. When the other servants asked her to play, she would smile and say, "Only when the work is done." And even then she would play quietly, like a whisper meant only for those who listened with kindness. One evening, the lady of the house invited her to sit for tea, something that had never happened before. The maid hesitated at first, not wanting to overstep her place, but the lady insisted with a smile. They sat near the window where the light from the setting sun filled the room. "You've brought more peace to this house than I could have imagined," the lady said softly, stirring her cup. "I used to think beauty came from what we could buy, but now I see it comes from what we give." The maid lowered her eyes, humbled by the words. "You gave me a chance," she said quietly. "I only did what I knew how to do." The lady smiled, her eyes kind. "Sometimes all it takes is one person brave enough to share their gift. You reminded me that kindness can start small, with a single note." The maid's heart warmed at the words, but she didn't know what to say. For so long she had lived her life unnoticed, moving through the house like part of the furniture. Now she was sitting at the same table as the woman who once seemed unreachable. The sound of the piano had somehow softened the distance between them, between rich and poor, between master and servant, between silence and understanding. But not everyone felt that way. Some of the guests who visited the house began to talk. They whispered that the lady was making a mistake, that showing too much favor to a maid might make others question her judgment. A few said crueler things, that music from a servant's hands was only charming because it was unusual, not because it was truly good. The lady ignored the gossip, but the maid could feel the tension in the air. During her lessons, she noticed the teacher's glances toward the door, as if he expected someone to interrupt. She understood that what she had been given, this chance to play, was something fragile. One wrong step, one misunderstanding, and it could all disappear. So she played quietly, humbly, always careful not to appear proud. But deep inside, her love for the piano grew stronger each day. One afternoon, a letter arrived at the mansion. It was from a man who ran a small music hall in the city. He had attended the winter dinner and had heard the maid play. He wrote that her performance had moved him deeply, and he wanted to invite her to perform at a charity event, a gathering meant to raise money for orphaned children. The lady of the house read the letter twice, then smiled. "This is a chance," she said. "Would you like to do it?" The maid froze. "Play in front of strangers?" she whispered, her hands trembling. "I wouldn't know how. They'll laugh at me." "They won't," the lady said gently. "If they have hearts, they won't. You have something rare, honesty in your music. That's what the world needs more of." The maid hesitated, fear and hope fighting inside her. But then she remembered her father's voice. "Don't ever let your music fade." She took a deep breath and nodded. The week leading up to the event felt like both a dream and a storm. Every spare moment she had, she practiced. Her fingers ached, but she didn't stop. The teacher helped her choose the songs, one her father had written long ago, and one she had composed herself. When the night finally came, the lady gave her a simple white dress to wear. "It's not new," she said, "but it will make you feel like yourself." The maid held the dress close, feeling tears gather in her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. The music hall wasn't large, but to her it looked like the grandest place she had ever seen. Lights hung above the stage and rows of people filled the seats. Her heart pounded as she stood behind the curtain, waiting. She could hear the crowd's murmur, the shuffling of feet, the clinking of glasses. When her name was announced, she walked slowly onto the stage. The lights were so bright that she couldn't see the faces in front of her. She sat at the piano, took a deep breath, and let her hands find their place. The first song was her father's, gentle, full of warmth, like sunlight through a window. As she played, she imagined him sitting nearby, smiling proudly. The sound flowed through her fingers as if he were guiding her. The second song was hers, slower, sadder, but filled with hope. It told the story of her life without using a single word, the loss, the silence, and the rediscovery of her voice through music. When she finished, the hall was silent. Then someone began to clap, followed by another, until the whole room was on its feet. The maid looked up, her heart beating fast. She couldn't believe it. People were standing for her, not because she was rich or important, but because she had made them feel something. Tears filled her eyes as she stood and bowed. In the crowd, she saw the lady of the house smiling through her own tears. The teacher wiped his eyes with his handkerchief. For a moment, the world felt soft and full of light. After the performance, people came to speak to her. Some thanked her. Others said her music reminded them of someone they had lost. One man said, "You made me remember what real music sounds like. Not the kind from training, but the kind from the soul." The maid didn't know what to say. She just smiled shyly and thanked them. When she returned to the mansion that night, the house was quiet. She went to the ballroom and stood before the piano. The moonlight poured through the window. Just as it had the first night she dared to press a single key, she placed her hand on the piano and whispered, "We did it, Papa." In that quiet room, she felt peace, the kind that doesn't shout but sits quietly in the heart, glowing. She knew that she might never become famous, that her life as a maid might continue as before, but it didn't matter anymore. She had found her voice, and nothing could take that away. Days later, a letter came from the music hall again. It said that her performance had inspired many, and they wanted her to come back, maybe even teach the children there. The lady smiled when she read it. "The world is calling for your music," she said. The maid hesitated, unsure what to answer. She had grown attached to this house, to the piano that had awakened her dreams, but she also felt something stirring, the thought that maybe her music could touch even more lives beyond these walls. That night, she played once more in the ballroom, her notes floating gently through the house. The servants listened from the doorway. The lady stood by the stairs, smiling softly. And outside, beyond the grand gates, the city lights glowed like scattered stars, waiting for the music that was yet to come. After her performance at the music hall, the maid's life began to change in ways she never expected. The night she played for the children's charity had felt like a dream. The lights, the applause, the faces filled with tears and smiles. For days afterward, she could still hear the sound of that final note echoing inside her. The lady of the house spoke about it often. "You made everyone in that room remember what kindness feels like," she said one morning over tea. "That is a gift, and not many have it." The maid didn't know how to respond. She wasn't used to being praised. She simply bowed her head and said, "I only played what I felt." But while the lady saw her performance as something pure and beautiful, the outside world began to see it as something more. The guests who had attended the concert spoke about the maid's story, the girl who once cleaned floors and now played music that made the wealthy cry. Newspapers mentioned her name briefly in their small columns. "A humble pianist," one called her, "who plays with the heart of a poet." At first, she didn't even know she had been written about. The cook brought her a crumpled piece of newspaper and said proudly, "You're in print now. Look at that." The maid looked at the tiny paragraph and smiled shyly. "It doesn't feel real," she whispered. Yet deep inside she felt something new, not pride but a quiet sense of purpose. Music was no longer just something she played for herself or for the walls of a rich house. It was something that reached people, something that healed. The lady began to receive letters from strangers who wanted to hear the maid play. Some were from people who had lost loved ones and said her story gave them hope. Others were from music teachers and students who wanted to meet her. It felt strange at first, being known by people she had never met. But she tried not to let it change her. She still cleaned, still helped in the kitchen, still smiled at the servants who had become her friends. But she also kept practicing. Every night after everyone went to bed, she would sit at the piano and play softly under the moonlight. The house would fall silent except for her music, which drifted through the halls like a gentle wind. The other servants sometimes listened quietly from their rooms, feeling a calm they couldn't explain. One afternoon, the lady called her to the sitting room. "I've received another letter," she said, handing it over. It was from a school for orphans in the city. They had heard about her charity performance and wanted her to visit, to play for the children and perhaps teach them a song or two. The maid read the letter slowly. Her hands trembled. "They want me to teach?" she asked softly. The lady nodded. "Yes, I think you should. Music should travel beyond these walls." The maid thought of the children who might not have parents, who might never have seen a piano up close. She remembered her own childhood, when her father's music was the only light they had in difficult times. She smiled faintly. "I will go," she said. The day she visited the orphanage, the sky was gray and heavy with clouds. The building was old but filled with laughter. The children gathered in the small hall, their eyes wide as they saw her walk in. To them she looked like someone from a different world, a lady from the city who had come to play. But when she sat at the piano and smiled at them, the space between them vanished. She began with a simple tune, something light and happy. The children clapped along, their little hands keeping rhythm. Then she played one of her father's melodies, slower, full of warmth. When she finished, a small boy in the front raised his hand shyly. "Can I try?" he asked. The maid nodded and lifted him onto the bench beside her. His fingers were small and unsure, pressing the wrong notes, but his eyes sparkled. She guided his hands gently. "Don't think too much," she told him softly. "Just feel it." The sound that came out wasn't perfect, but it was real. The children cheered. The maid smiled wider than she had in years. That day she stayed for hours, teaching them little songs, clapping along as they sang. When she left, the children hugged her and asked when she would come again. She promised she would. Back at the mansion, she told the lady everything. "They don't have much," she said, "but they have hearts full of joy." "It reminded me why music matters," the lady nodded. "Then you must keep going back," and so she did. Every week she returned to the orphanage. Sometimes she played. Sometimes she just listened as the children made up songs of their own. They began calling her Miss Melody, a name she never forgot. But while her music was touching hearts, not everyone was happy about her growing attention. A few wealthy guests who had once admired her began to whisper that her story was being exaggerated. "A maid teaching music?" one of them said at a dinner. "It's charming, but let's be realistic. She's no real musician." The lady overheard those words and quietly replied, "Maybe not in your world, but in mine, she's the most real musician I've ever known." Despite the murmurs, the maid's journey continued. The small charity hall invited her again, this time to play alongside other performers. Each time she played, the audience fell silent, not because of fame, but because her music carried something pure, something people had forgotten to feel. Months passed, and spring arrived. The garden of the mansion bloomed with colors. The piano, once a forgotten piece of furniture, now stood proudly by the window, always polished, always waiting. One evening, the lady found the maid sitting quietly at the piano, staring out the window. "You're thinking," the lady said softly. The maid nodded. "About how far I've come," she said. "And how it all started with just one note." The lady smiled. "Sometimes that's all it takes to change everything. One brave moment." The maid turned to her, her eyes shining. "Do you think my father knows?" "I believe he does," the lady said gently. "Every time you play, he listens." The maid felt tears in her eyes. She looked down at her hands, remembering his rough fingers guiding hers when she was little. She played one of his songs then, just for him. The melody floated through the house, tender and full of love. That night she sat by her window and looked out at the city lights. She didn't dream of fame or money. She dreamed of more children learning to play, of more hearts finding peace in music. She dreamed of giving what her father had given her, hope through sound. Over the next few months, she continued teaching at the orphanage. The children began to improve, and one day they surprised her. When she arrived, they had prepared a small performance, each child playing a part of a melody she had taught them. It wasn't perfect, but it was beautiful. She clapped with tears streaming down her face. "You made this happen," one of the older girls said, hugging her. "No," the maid replied softly. "We made it happen together." Back at the mansion, the lady decided to host another event. This time not for the wealthy, but for the children and townsfolk. The grand ballroom that once only welcomed silk and jewels now opened its doors to laughter and simple clothes. The maid played and the children sang. The servants joined in. For once, the house belonged to everyone. As the night ended, the lady stood beside the maid and whispered, "This is what I always wanted my home to feel like." The maid smiled. "It finally does." When the last guest had gone, she sat at the piano one last time that night. Her fingers pressed a single note, the same one she had played years ago when the house was silent and she was just a maid afraid of being caught. The sound filled the room again, pure, soft, full of memory. She closed her eyes, and in that one note lived everything: her father's lessons, the kindness she had been shown, and the love she had shared. It was the sound of a heart that had once been invisible, now shining, now heard. The morning after the grand event at the mansion, the house was unusually quiet. The laughter from the night before had faded, but its warmth still lingered in the air. The servants went about their duties softly, speaking in hushed voices as if afraid to disturb the peace that music had left behind. The maid woke early, as she always did, and went to the kitchen to help. But something in her felt different that morning. Maybe it was the way the sunlight came through the window, or the way the piano still glimmered faintly in the corner of her mind. For the first time in years, she felt no fear of being forgotten. She poured herself a small cup of tea and sat by the back door, watching the garden. The flowers were blooming again, their colors bright and alive. She thought about all that had happened, how a simple sound had carried her from scrubbing floors to playing for hundreds, how a single kind heart had opened a door that changed everything. The lady of the house joined her a few minutes later. She carried a small envelope in her hand. "You have another letter," she said with a smile. The maid took it carefully. The handwriting was neat but unfamiliar. She opened it slowly, her heart beating faster as she read. It was from a man who ran a small music institute in another town. He had heard about her through the charity events in the orphanage. The letter said that they wanted her to come and teach, not just for one day but as part of their school. The maid looked up, eyes wide. "They want me to be a teacher," she whispered, as if saying it too loudly would make it disappear. The lady nodded. "They see what I've seen all along, someone who was born to share music." The maid hesitated. "But this house, you, the children, everything I know is here." "I know," the lady said softly, "but you can't keep a song locked inside one room forever. It was meant to travel, to reach more hearts. And so were you." The maid sat quietly for a long moment. The idea of leaving scared her, but deep inside she felt it was time. Her father's words came back to her. "Don't ever let your music fade." That afternoon, she went to the ballroom one last time. The piano stood there polished and perfect. She ran her hand along its edge, remembering every note she had ever played, every tear, every smile that had filled this room. Then she sat down and began to play. It wasn't a song she had practiced. It wasn't even one she knew. It simply came to her, soft, flowing, full of memory. It told the story of her journey, from the first note she had dared to play to this very moment when she was ready to move forward. The servants gathered quietly near the doorway. The lady stood by the window listening. The music seemed to carry something from each of them: gratitude, pride, love. When the song ended, no one spoke for a while. Then the lady said gently, "That was a farewell and a beginning all in one." The maid smiled faintly. Maybe that's what music really is. Never an end, only a change. A few days later, she packed her small suitcase. She didn't own much: a few dresses, her father's old notebook filled with melodies, and the white dress the lady had given her for the charity concert. Before she left, she walked through the house one last time. Each room held memories: laughter in the kitchen, kindness in the hallways, and the piano's echo in the ballroom. The lady met her at the front steps. "You'll always have a home here," she said, her voice soft but steady. The maid's eyes filled with tears. "You gave me more than a home," she said. "You gave me courage." The lady reached out and squeezed her hand. "Go and give that courage to others." The carriage waited outside. The maid turned once more to look at the mansion, the windows glowing in the morning sun. It no longer looked like a place of distance and wealth. It looked like a place where something beautiful had been born. As the carriage moved away, she watched the road stretch ahead, winding, uncertain but open. She felt both fear and excitement. The air outside the city smelled different, freer. She leaned her head against the window and closed her eyes. imagining all the new songs waiting to be discovered. When she arrived at the Music Institute, it was smaller than she had imagined. A few rooms, a modest hall, and a handful of pianos that had seen better days. But she didn't mind. The children there greeted her shyly, just as the orphans once had. They called her teacher, a word that felt strange on her tongue but warmed her heart. Her first lesson was simple. She told them to close their eyes and listen, not to the notes but to the space between them. "That's where the feeling lives," she said softly. The children learned quickly. Some struggled at first, pressing too hard or losing rhythm, but she never scolded them. She would say, "Don't fight the music, let it talk through you." Weeks turned into months. The maid, now the teacher, and found herself busier than ever. But it was a good kind of busy. Every morning she woke with a purpose. Every evening she left the classroom with her heart full. Sometimes she would receive letters from the lady of the house. They spoke of the mansion, of how the piano still sang in her absence, and how the servants often played the songs she had taught them. Each letter reminded her that no distance could silence the bond they shared. One summer afternoon, she decided to take her students to the orphanage where her journey had truly begun. The children there remembered her, and when they saw her arrive with new faces, they ran to greet her. She introduced her students, and together they filled the small hall with music and laughter. As she watched them play, she felt something shift inside her. It wasn't pride exactly. It was peace, the kind that comes from knowing you're exactly where you're meant to be. Later that day, one of the smallest students tugged on her sleeve and asked, "Teacher, were you always a musician?" She smiled gently. "No," she said. "Once I was just a maid who loved to listen." "Then how did you become like this?" the child asked. The maid looked at the piano, its keys shining in the sunlight. "By playing one note," she said softly. One brave note that changed everything. The child thought for a moment, then smiled. "Then I'll find my note too." That night, as she walked home, the sound of children's laughter followed her. The air was warm and the sky was painted with stars. She looked up and whispered, "We did it, Papa." Back in her small room, she opened her father's old notebook. Some pages were blank, waiting for new melodies. She dipped her pen in ink and began to write again. Not to impress anyone, not for fame, but simply because music was how her heart spoke to the world. Years passed. The maid's story spread quietly, told from one person to another. Not as a tale of riches or fame, but as a reminder that beauty can come from the humblest places. That one note, played with sincerity, could awaken hearts long asleep. Sometimes she would visit the mansion again. The lady, older now, would welcome her with open arms. They would sit together in the old ballroom and she would play once more on the same piano where it all began. "Do you ever miss the days when you were just the maid?" the lady asked once. The teacher smiled. "I still am in some ways. I still clean the dust off the piano keys before I play." They both laughed, the sound gentle and full of memory. As the final years of her life approached, the maid-turned-teacher continued to play. Her hands grew slower, her fingers thinner, but the emotion in her music never faded. If anything, it deepened. One winter evening, she played alone in her little classroom. The children had gone home and the snow fell softly outside. She pressed one note, then another, and listened to the sound fill the quiet room. The melody was simple, the same one she had played long ago in that grand mansion, when she was only a maid cleaning the floor and dared to touch the piano for the first time. As the final note lingered in the air, she smiled faintly. The sound seemed to blend with the wind outside, carrying her music far beyond the walls, to the city, the mansion, the orphanage, and maybe to her father's memory. Her story had come full circle. The maid who once played one note in secret had given her music to the world, and in doing so, she had found herself, and though she would one day fade from this world, her melody would live on, in the hearts of those she taught, in the children who learned to play, and in the quiet moments when someone, somewhere, pressed a single key and remembered that beauty often begins in the most unexpected hands.